So first off, welcome and hello to everyone for attending my presentation on mapping. Firstly, I would like to acknowledge that we live, work, and study in a region that overlaps with the unceded, traditional, and ancestral First Nations territories of the Musqueam, Cadsi, Semiahmoo, Tsawwassen, Kikite, and Coquitlam, and with the lands of the Kwantlen First Nation, which gifted its name to this university. Oh, sorry, technical glitch here. I'm trying to figure out what happened with my layout. Ah, okay. Sorry about that. The system responded a bit slowly. My apologies. As usual, what I like to do is give an idea of what I aim to do in my presentation today. So my aim is to give you an overview, as the field of mapping itself is huge, and the discipline of cartography overlaps both the arts and the sciences. So what I will cover today is why we map, how we map, and what are some of the uses and misuses of map, and end up with why maps are important to me, to highlight something about the research that I'm currently doing. So the first question I want to start off is the question of the phrase, "Here be dragons." So what you see on screen is the Hunt Lennox reproduction of the globe that dates from 1508, and it is only one of two known instances of historical map that actually use the Latin phrase "Hic sunt dracones," which means "here be dragons." And this itself is a reconstruction by Benjamin Franklin d'Acosta in 1879, and it shows the European understanding of the world at that time, with the notion that dragons in the Far East, or where Southeast Asia would be, is where they would highlight their fear, yet their fascination of the unknown and the drive towards discovering what new places there might be. The next question I want to deal with is why we map. So as you can see here, Susan Hillard, in her book, Dream Maps, very succinctly describes why we map. We map because we want to communicate something that is spatially complex, like a spiral staircase, and it is easier to draw it in the air or on paper than to define it in words. So in the same way, ideas and experiences that are temporally, that is in time, or intellectually complex, often can be understood more clearly from diagrams or maps than from verbal description. So essentially, diagrams and maps often help people to see the issue or the problem more clearly, to clarify what they have to deal with. So just simple introduction to maps. So if maps are visual communication tools, it means that their messages are also through some form of other medium. This means that we pick and choose what we want to depict on maps. Hence, not all maps are created equal, which raises the question or the issue of cartographic quality. And just to clarify, cartography is the art and science of mapping, both the creation as well as the reading and interpretation of map. And this is something that we do not quite teach in our most of our high school or elementary school curriculum. And yet, increasingly, we are bombarded by maps on a daily basis. So whenever we look at any of our media, maps are part and parcel of the message that they send to us. So we need to be aware of how we critique and consume maps. But to do that, we also need to understand how we use maps. So maps are excellent for recording and storing information. In fact, one of the earliest uses of the map was for cadastre or property maps. The early Egyptian kingdoms actually employed inspectors to survey the land for taxation purposes. So this was one of the ways that they resource money so that they could build big monuments like the pyramids. So maps become important legal documents as well. And this is why oftentimes when you're dealing with property issues, maps become the de facto records or information stores through which we can identify who owns what land. Maps also present and communicate, especially difficult and complex ideas and concepts. By depicting features of interest in a 2D form, it allows the user to read the information such as adjacency, centrality, and proximity, which are often very difficult to describe in words. So we often use mapping terms itself in our everyday use, such as, we say we want to map out our strategies. So maps can be used to not only demonstrate what we are trying to show, but also persuade people to accept what you're trying to show. And at the same time, we need to be cognizant of the fact that they can equally inform as well as misinform people about the true nature of the data that they are presenting. Last but not least, maps help us to analyze geographic relationship. So they are indispensable because, for example, understanding where the resources are distributed is crucial to world's economy. You might have heard of the ongoing issues between Russia and Ukraine and how Donald Trump, the president of USA, is saying that rare earth minerals can be gathered from them. So, what visualization also implies is that we all have a mental map that becomes more complex with our experiences, but at the same time, it remains selective. So to give you an idea of that, I just wanted to show you this map of the family circus. So as you can see, when we are kids, our mental map often tends to be very limited. So this is a classic example of this young girl going to visit her friend's home, and then unfortunately, when they want to go back home, instead of taking a shortcut of 3 blocks, their mental map is only clear about the route back to the school and the route back from the school to their home. So this is oftentimes what we encounter in our daily life. For example, we are creatures of habit, so we have preferred routes that we take, and then unfamiliar places, will always remain blank, leading to situations like the one above. Another mental map that I wanted to show you is this sketch drawn by a student at Concordia University as part of a class exercise in recalling locations. So notice how locations that are important to the student are clearly marked and identified. One of the ones that I really want to highlight to you is Tim Horton. So obviously Tim Horton is very, very important to this one person. So what I'm trying to show to you with this map is that locations um, change into places that have meaning and value to people. So this is the fundamental concept behind geography. We are interested in places and we map places, but places themselves have two components. The first component is obviously the objective location with unique uh, spots as well as interdependent with other spots around them. For example, we use latitude and longitude to locate positions on Earth with the equator and the prime meridian as references. Another example is street addresses. The number allows you to locate the position based on where it is sequentially on a street. And this is exactly how Google Map finds street addresses in real time instead of storing every single address and its location in a geodatabase. The second part of a place is the subjective social and cultural construct. So locations only become a place when we give some kind of value and meaning to that location. So it is subjective. So some places will have very strong symbolic values because of the building, events, people, or histories with which they are associated. So for example, if you look at the image on the left, this shows you the Peace Tower at Parliament Hill in Ottawa. So obviously, this would be of political importance to many Canadians, and especially now when we talk about what is happening in terms of the Liberal leader election, as well as the potential general federal election that is going to come up sometime this year. The other image on the right also shows you what people tend to think about Canada. So this evokes the notion of Canada as being somehow remote, with lots of wilderness, or it is the Great White North. Right. To give you an example, when I was a young child growing up in Singapore, I used to watch a movie, or sorry, a series called Sergeant Preston of the Yukon. And in this black and white episodes, the sergeant, in this case Preston, would go out and do all of his police keeping in his full weight search as the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, riding a horse with his trusted dog King. But in every single episode, there was always snow on the ground. So as far as I was concerned as a young child, Canada was nothing but a snowy terrain. So please remember that places only become when we give meaning and value based on our own experience to these locations. And what is a location to someone might be a place to someone else. For example, where you live is a location to me, but obviously it is a very important place to you. So ultimately, what this means is that we create maps based on our perceptions. And these perceptions have been with us for a very long time. So to give you one of the earliest perceptions of places, this is the idea of the cosmomagical city that is the Forbidden City in Beijing. This is the innermost and most important ceremonial building in Beijing. The hall is set upon as an auspicious number of 3 tiers. So from the gate of the supreme harmony, the emperor will be carried on his palanquin above the dragon pavement, which would have carved depictions of his dragon and other auspicious symbols such as waves, mountains, and clouds. So the Forbidden City itself marked the inner sanctum of the imperial city, and this is to reflect the model of harmony and moral order, which expresses the will of the heaven. So it is by rituals and cosmic correctness, which imbibes in the city form through some form of divination or orientation. And this gives us the rectangular or square grid that is defined by walls and gates. So if you are cognizant of the traffic pattern in this part of the world, you'll notice that a grid pattern is often repeated in many parts of the world. Maps also depict people's ideas of the world at their point in time. This is the famous TO or Isidorian map, and it is considered the first map that was printed in a book in 1472. It depicts the Christian worldview of the time, with continents on Asia, Europe, and Africa as populated by the descendants of Noah's 3 sons, right? Shem, Japheth, and Ham, sorry. And as you can see, Asia is depicted in the top or the north because this was considered to be the original site of the Garden of Eden. And as our understanding of the earth increased, we have other forms of map. So in 1581, the Bunting Cloverleaf map was published. This symbolizes the Christian Trinity, with Jerusalem right in the center. You can also notice how the Red Sea is clearly marked here, right? As well as the Americas, which was newly discovered, so they named it the New World. So maps can reflect people's ideas of what they thought the world to be. Right? And this is not something that is ancient in the past few hundred years. It can be as recent as the last century. and it reflects on the landscape itself. For example, this is the map where the highlight is how culture is reflected in space. So cultural geography, as part of its large ambit, deals with how culture shapes places, how places shape culture, and how places acquire meaning. So this particular image that you see shows the English grid system that was used in the Lower Fraser Valley region from 1859 to 1890. So one result of this grid system is how land is divided into sections and how major roads are spaced within the municipalities of Metro Vancouver. An excellent example of this that we still see today is the city of Richmond, where if you look at a map of the city of Richmond with their numbered roads in the north-south alignment, they are all exactly 1 mile apart. So from there, you can figure out your distances from one location to another whenever you're traveling in the city of Richmond. Maps also define the cultures that we live in. And I show this map to highlight the fact that in space, we arbitrarily assign what is north and what is south. Right? There's no such thing as north, south, east, or west in space. So if map making were to start in the southern hemisphere, then this would be the common map of the world, right? So it is somewhat interesting because oftentimes we tend to think of the northern hemisphere being completely filled with land masses, while the southern hemisphere tends to be primarily sea. Here we flip that notion upside down. So there is essentially no one right way or wrong way to show a map. It is based on the purpose and the cultural norms that dictate how a map should be done, which then leads to situations where map can be massaged or manipulated to produce what we can call a propaganda map. So I'm using two examples here. The first example shows you how in circa 1920, the common thinking about civilizations in the USA showed where the areas of high intelligence, high income, and infant mortality, low infant mortalities are located. Right? Whereas less favored areas are found in the south. So the idea being that somehow the richer, more affluent, well-to-do people tend to live in the north as opposed to the poorer people living in the south. Unfortunately, when you take these kinds of ideas, oftentimes rooted in concepts like environmental determinism, it then states that the nature of the physical environment determines or causes the social and cultural patterns that were present in that area and hence used to justify imperialism and racism. Right? So these two maps on the right were used by Ellsworth Huntington, who was a geographer, to link environmental and racial discrimination. Right? So look at the areas of very high climatic energy in relation to areas of very high civilization. So this raises questions about whether such environmental determinism is true today and raises questions about how we reconcile these kinds of ideas with concepts like Darwin's theory of biological evolution, which clearly shows that the environment influences the creatures that live in an area. Or the concept of crime prevention through environmental design, or SEPTEP, which attempts to modify disruptive behaviors through appropriate design of the physical environment. As a counter to this, I wanted to show you this particular propaganda map. In the previous map, you saw how maps can be used to justify abhorrent ideas. In this case, map can be also used to promote ideas. So this particular map, entitled The Awakening, was published in 1915. So it symbolizes the women's desire to have the right to vote, which was already granted in the Western state. And so they are marching towards the east to try and encourage the women and help the women in the eastern states to achieve that goal as well. Right? Um, the next thing I want to show you is that all maps do not necessarily need to represent the actual landscape. So this is an excellent example of a flow map. Okay. It is Charles Joseph Minard's 1869 floor map of Napoleon's failed 1812 Russian campaign, and is often used as a classic example of spatio-temporal visualization, where it shows both space and time. Right? This particular map displays 6 types of data in 2 dimensions. This particular map itself shows the number of Napoleon's troops. Right? So you have numbers along the side, the distance that they travel, the temperatures at different stages, the longitude and latitudes, the direction of the travel going forward and coming back, as well as the location of relative to specific dates. So what you can see here is on this one simple map, it shows you how the campaign that started with 144,000 troops only ended up in Moscow with 100,000 troops. And after the defeat, as they came back, they lost lots of troops until when they reached back to their staging ground, they only had about 10,000 troops. So maps are wonderful in trying to encapsulate not only static displays, but also dynamic displays in terms of movement. Other forms of maps can highlight the features of interest and distort the map based on those particular variables. Right? So if smaller areas have higher values, they are deliberately distorted to look bigger. So in this example, you can see how the population of Canada and Australia are in relation to the populations of India and China. Okay. They are huge in the billions, and hence they overshadow the populations of our 2 countries, Canada and Australia, which have a population of less than 50 million each. Right? Even Indonesia has over 200 million people, and hence it is much larger. Right? And when you look at the very top, you see Russia with a population of over 140 million people, and yet it is only shown as a thin sliver because of its relative size in terms of population to the 2 largest countries of China and India. So maps can be used to portray ideas, to inform people in ways that regular description cannot do. However, when we deal with maps, we need geographic data about the geographic phenomena that we are interested in. So what it means is that we need to be aware of what are the main characteristics of geographic data. There are 3 important characteristics that we need to remember. First and foremost, all geographic data are spatially related, right? Which means that every element on this earth has some form of geographic information about them. You can even consider your own self. Think about all of the geographic data that are associated with you, such as your street address where you live, or the room of your office, or all of the geotagged photographs that you have in your cell phone. Right? It is often estimated that anywhere around 80% of the digital data that we have some form of geographic element associated with it. Geographic data also have scale, right? Which provides the context for analysis. Events such as climate change, which we are so concerned about today, can occur right from the very smallest local scale to the largest global scale. So knowing which scale we are using for a particular analysis becomes important in not skewing the results that we are wanting to display. Last but not least, all geographic data are dynamic, both spatially and temporally. So things change not only in space, but also in time. So one simple way of considering it is consider how much of the landscape of Metro Vancouver has changed in the last 100 years. So what mapping allows is to reveal all of those previously hidden information by using these three characteristics. But mapping also means that we have to deal with two different sets of data. For every location, we need to deal with not only the differences in their location, but also the attribute or the values associated with them. So in this example, you can see how we can deal with just the locations of the features. Okay? So in this example, simple example, I have two circles and four squares. And you can see that both the two diagrams show exactly the same number of circles and squares. The one on the left shows a more clustered pattern because the circles are together and the stars, sorry, I should have said stars, not squares, are in a simple C shape. In the other adjacent figure, you can see how the circles are at two corners while the stars are spread out in the middle. And yet, despite this different visual distribution, the frequency of the stars in the circle is the same. So this is an example of how the location of features can be different, yet their frequency distribution can be the same. Conversely, we can also have the other issue where the locations are all the same. So in this example, we have streets and avenues. So all the properties are aligned in a 4x4 grid with 16 locations. However, the values found in those 16 locations can be different. So in this simple example, I'm using property values. And again, you can see how the property values are very different between the one on the left and the one on the right. Despite all of this, the actual distribution of the property values by count is identical. So what I'm trying to highlight through these two slides, the previous one and this, is to remind people that traditional statistics oftentimes have some challenges when we have to deal with geographic data. And hence, please remember that the same frequency distribution can show very different distributions and patterns of spatial data. Over and above these two considerations, we also need to look at how we classify or present the data. So in this example, I'm using the populations of other countries around the world, using the same 7 classes as a number of class to show the data. So same data set, nothing has changed. The only difference is what my classification scheme is. In the first, I have natural breaks. In the second, top right, I have equal interval. Bottom left, I have quantiles. And in the bottom right, I have standard deviation. So as you can see, when we compare, for example, equal interval, we end up in a situation where we only highlight the two biggest populations found on this planet. Whereas if we use the quantile, it masks those differences. Okay? So in this particular example, based on the distribution, natural breaks might be a better classification scheme than the other 3 classification schemes that we have here. So essentially, we need to be um, let me repeat that. We need to explore the data sets to come to an understanding of the underlying distribution of the features of interest before we decide what kind of classification scheme that we can use to display the data that we have. Adding to all of this challenge is also the fact that the globe or the world is not a two-dimensional reality. So when mapping at the global scale, we have to project to translate the three-dimensional globe onto a two-dimensional map for practical purposes. So imagine trying to peel an orange and somehow flattening and stretching the peel to form a rectangle. So we need some kind of mathematical model to accomplish this for mapping the globe. However, different map projections that you can see here displays the world differently, and it distorts the size and the shape of land masses in different ways. So this top left projection system is the most common projection system that we tend to encounter on most maps, the Mercator projection system. It is used because it shows compass direction very accurately between any 2 points, and the shape of the land masses tend to be true. So the shapes are true, and compass direction is true, and so it is wonderful for navigation. However, it distorts the sizes of the land masses as you move away from the equator. So this is one of the reasons why you see that Greenland looks as if it is the same size as Africa, or uh, Antarctica tends to be the largest landmass on this map. Oftentimes, we do not show Antarctica. Why? Because Antarctica is represented by a single point, which is the South Pole. But that point has now become a line, and hence it has distorted the size of the landmass of Antarctica. Right? Mollywald projection on the right tends to show the size and the shape in true, the size in true form, but the shapes are changed and is very difficult to use for navigation purposes. The polyconic allows us to get very accurate measurements along the central corridors, but every other location is no longer true to its location. We can also use regional projections like the azimuthal equidistant projection. So this is wonderful if we are looking at navigating in the North Pole Arctic region. Right? So essentially, what we must be aware of is that we need to choose the right projection system, as it is critical for portraying the right representation of the globe for the purpose at hand. Then, adding to all of this challenges is the fact that we also have to deal with the scale of the data that we are interested in. In geography, scale provides context for any analysis. So, as I stated before, climate change can occur at the smallest local level, all the way up to the largest global scale. So we tend to reduce the Earth to show as a map in a given space, or in this case, a given sheet. So a small scale map reduces the world many times, while a large scale map only reduces it a small number of times. And because of this reduction, we can see in this large scale map the street grid pattern, as well as features, the individual features in the small location of the cusp. Whereas in the small scale map that we have here, the cusp is seen as a small little dot in the southeast, or bottom right corner of British Columbia. So what I'm trying to get to you, or trying to make you understand, is scale is important when we deal with the phenomena that we are interested in. And if we are not aware of the interplay between projection systems and scale, then we end up in a situation where we truly do not understand the sizes of different locations. For example, the true size of Africa. Okay? So in this example, you can see how Africa is actually large enough to include not one, but three of the seven largest countries in the world: China, United States, and India, and yet have enough space for other places like Eastern Europe, as well as some of the big countries of France, Germany, and Spain, Italy, as well as the UK in Madagascar. Right? So the next time you see a map of the world, just be aware that Africa is in fact a very large continent. It only looks small because it is located near the equator, and hence locations further away from the equator tends to be stretched to make them look bigger. Maps that we use on a daily basis do not need to represent reality exactly. Okay. Earlier on, I introduced a flow map to highlight how reality does not need to be exact in its representation. This is obviously the famous London Tube map. And as you can see, while it is iconic and very useful, it also distorts people's sense of distances. So I did a little research about distances between stations, and the shortest distance between two stations is actually between Euston and Euston Square in the middle of this map. It is only 56 meters apart. So you can walk from one station to another very easily in under 5 minutes. However, if you're traveling by the tube, you now have to switch lines to get to from one station to the other, which takes you about 20 minutes if you've ever done that on the line. So what I'm trying to tell you with this is that oftentimes we carry these maps in our mind without properly understanding how it distorts our vision of reality. Okay? But maps are wonderful in also highlighting our ideas of who we are and what we think we are. Right? And that is the map that I want to show you here. Right? It reflects the ideas of a people living in this area. So this is a map of what Canadians thought about Canada that Maclean's magazine did a couple of years ago. Right? So you can see how we look at um, British Columbia, and at that time, Albertans had lots of oil, and so they were buying up properties where we live. So this is where Albertans vacation, whereas the oil industry, booming oil industry, led to where oil trucks and pickup oils are found in that location. Whereas if you look at Nunavut, it's all ice and snow with Santa's vacation home right at the top. Right? So we can come up with different kinds of ideas about the very land that we live in, and in some cases laugh at ourselves, and in other cases get into heated discussions about who we are and who we are not. Okay? So when we start to put all of these ideas together, oftentimes it makes us question our very understanding of what maps show. So what I'm trying to show you here is that just as maps are useful to question and clarify some of our basic assumptions of an area, it also raises conundrums about how we actually label those areas. So as of the 1st of July 2024, just under 35 million people, or 85% of the Canadian population, live in what we call functional urban areas. However, when you look at the total area occupied by those functional urban areas, it covers less than 1% of Canada's land area. So then this raises an interesting question. So how do you define Canada? Is it an urban country or is it a rural country? Especially when the average population density is less than 5 people or person per square kilometer. Right? So what I'm trying to highlight to you with these kinds of map is that oftentimes when map depict a particular set of data, be aware of the purpose of why they are showing you the data and question whether there are other ways of interpreting the data that you see on the map. So, to before I end up with this presentation, I just wanted to show you what I am currently working on for my own at-leave research at the moment. So I am looking at how earthquake data can be shown using spatial statistics. In this case, I'm using standard deviational ellipses. So think of standard deviational ellipses as the two-dimensional form of your standard deviation that you'll get from traditional statistics. Right? So I chose earthquakes of magnitude 3 and higher for the year 2018, just as an example. And then when I showed the standard deviational ellipse using one standard deviation, um, it shows that the alignment of all of the earthquakes, which are shown as these black dots, form this particular shape with this particular alignment, which is sort of northwest to southeast along the main subduction zone or the earthquake zone. Right? However, when I start to differentiate or subset the data by month, the pattern or the shapes change. So this is for January 2018. So you can see that it still looks very similar to the pattern that I showed for the whole year. In February, it becomes much larger because of the variability. Some earthquakes are found in the far north, while others are located further south. In March, it is much tighter, so this gives an idea that most of the earthquakes happen in a small, or sorry, in a rather small area within the subduction zone found here. Um, and then in April, it is very narrow but much dispersed. In May, it becomes wider, and then things begin to become interesting. In June, the orientation starts to change and the variability becomes much more spread out. In July, it looks more like an egg, and in August, it actually changes directions completely. So this is almost orthogonal or 90 degrees to the yearly standard deviational ellipse. In September, it flips back to the regular orientation. And in October, it becomes really, really tight. November, it spreads out a bit more. And in December, it becomes a more or less oval. Right. So what I'm trying to get to you with these kinds of spatial statistics is that data that we try to map tells us different stories when we subset the data in different ways. Right? As a geographer looking at this as part of my research, I have other questions to ask. Questions like why does this pattern exist? Is it because there are certain types of tectonic activities happening now? So this can be very relevant to what we are trying to do today, especially when we had a recent 5.1 earthquake that happened just off the coast of the lower mainland. Right? So mapping like this becomes very, very useful in understanding underlying processes that are deep underground that we have no way of experiencing or recording directly. So this sort of gives you an idea of the different ways that we can map the world and how we can use different tools and techniques that we have to map the world. So to conclude, I want to go back to the original question of here be dragons, right? So where be dragons? Well, this is a classic example of where the imaginary dragon lies in the lower mainland itself. I grew up in Singapore, where there was a large Chinese population, where feng shui, or the concept of living in harmony with the environment, was very strong. And so ideas about the Chinese dragons were very prominent in that part of the world. If you look at a Chinese dragon, oftentimes depicted at the top of the temples in Asia, you notice that the Chinese dragons are not like the European dragons with wings. They do not have wings, they have horns, and they have beards. So if you look at this lower mainland location, the endowment land in Vancouver becomes the snout of the upper jaw of the dragon. Stanley Park becomes the horns of the dragon. And SFU becomes where the eye of the dragon would be. Uh, Delta becomes the gaping lower jaw of the dragon, with Point Roberts and Tuason becoming the beard. And in this gaping mouth is where Richmond is found. And hence, according to Feng Shui, this is considered the pearl in the mouth of the dragon. And this is also is one of the reasons why people of Chinese descent likes Richmond, because not only is it in the mouth of the dragon, but the Fraser River, which represents the spine of this dragon, brings us up to places like Quesnel and Barkerville, which is where gold was mined during the gold rush. So essentially, Richmond is a choice location. Because this is where the prosperity and the gold that is washed down by the mountains comes and engulfs Richmond in the mouth of the dragon. And hence, if you are somebody who strongly believes in feng shui or comes from that part of the world, you are going to want to locate yourself in Richmond because that is the choicest location according to feng shui in this part of the world. So I hope with this little presentation, I've given you an overview of what maps are, what are some of the challenges that we have with maps. And to end, I just want to remind you that all maps are models of reality. Right? They reflect humans' concept as well as the dreams that we have of the natural world. So, therefore, map reading and interpretation are essential skills um, that we need today because we are increasingly bombarded by map, and yet we do not know how to truly critique them. So, with that, I will end my presentation. Thank you, and I'll ask you if you have any questions, and I will stop sharing my slide. Thank you.
Wonderful, Parthi. Thank you so much. We're gonna open now for questions from the audience. So feel free to raise your hand or type your question in the chat. Chira and then Carlos.
I have more of a comment rather than a
Okay.
question, but I have to say, Parthi, this was absolutely fascinating.
Thank you.
I will never look at the BC map again with the same lens that I have used so far. I'll be looking at the dragon. And I
Yes,
absolutely loved how you brought together the scientific perspective, the historical perspective, the cultural perspective, and then the fiction that you excited in our imagination. So thank you so much. I've always absolutely loved maps, but really enjoyed how you presented it. And I also remember at one time and there's a mention about that how sometimes the prejudicial perspectives are reflected in maps too. So I remember growing up with maps that whenever you look at the world map, in the center would always be the North Americas.
exactly.
I mean,
Yes.
why do we have to look at it that way? Like, why can't we put, Africa, the other side of it? So it just brings back a lot of points together. So thank you from the bottom of my heart for such
Oh,
a
thank you.
wonderful
You're
presentation.
welcome, and thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chira. Carlos.
Uh, Thank you very much. That was a marvelous presentation. I very much enjoyed it. As I was listening to you, I was thinking of the way in which the ancient Nahuatl would depict their maps. You know, how now we conceive of the north as being on the top.
Oh,
For the ancient Nahuatl, it was not the north, it was the east that was
yes,
put at the top
exactly.
because that's where the sun comes, hence
Yeah.
the importance. You know, that's where the sun is born and then
Yes,
it dies in the
exactly.
west,
The
which is
West.
depicted down. So I was thinking also about how mapping in itself could be also an exercise of power, an act of
Yes,
domination,
absolutely,
because not
absolutely.
everybody gets to map the world.
Yes,
And you know we have to ask ourselves who does the mapping and who consumes the map, because when we
yes,
consume it we are internalizing that, you know, representation
absolutely.
that is done by those with power. So I was wondering if you could comment um, on the recent renaming of, you know, the Gulf of Mexico and Gulf of America, and you know how, you know, these disputes are going on and showing that kind of like power
Okay.
conflicts through mapping today.
Yeah. I hope the recording is stopped. So this is sort of off the cuff comments. Yes, you can see how people, have different ideas of how maps come about, and it is a very powerful medium that informs people. So who draws the map now has the power in deciding what you show. Right? Like Gulf of Mexico, Gulf of Mexico being renamed Gulf of America. Yes, on the one hand, you can say that makes sense because, when you say America, and this is what most people don't tend to recognize, it applies to anybody who lives in North, Central, and South America. All of us are Americans. And yet, when we think of America, we only think about the USA. right? So, in that sense, naming it Gulf of America, yeah, sure, you can say it makes sort of sense. But then historically, it has always been named as Gulf of Mexico. Right? So this is why naming conventions can sometimes become challenging and contentious, and people fight over how you name things because it gives you power, or you lose power when you don't have that name. Right? To give you a more personal example of for myself, I found that some of the terms that we use to describe people from different parts of the world somewhat challenging. Right. So when I first came to this part of the world, I encountered the term Asian. Right. Coming from Asia itself, when I encountered the term Asian, I would consider anybody in the huge continent of Asia being Asian. So they can be, fair skinned, light colored, green eyed in the far western part of Asia, or almost European like in the steppes region of Russia. Whereas if you come to the Far East, they look more like the Chinese and the Oriental people. My apologies if I'm using outdated terminology. But then if you go down south to, let's say, Southeast Asia, you find people who are dark, and people like my own ancestry from South India, who the Dravidians, as we call ourselves, some of us are really dark to the point where we almost have a bluish tinge. Right. So Asia has such a huge variability, and yet when we say Asian, we only think about one corner of Asia. Right. And then other terms like when I came here, I was labeled as a South Asian. And then when I look at the world map, yes, I can understand why I'm called South Asian because my ancestry is from India, and India is in the southern part of Asia. But then no part of India is south of the equator. So technically, it is in the northern hemisphere. So what does it mean to be a South Asian? Right? Or the other term that was labeled like East Indians, right? So I'm an East Indian. So, but then the British took Indians from India and put them all over the world. So you have places like the West Indies. So one of the jokes I have with my class, first year level class, is about misnomers. I tell them, so if I were born in the West Indies in the Caribbean, right? So what am I now? Am I a West East Indian or am I East West Indian? Right? So you have those kinds of labels. So oftentimes I find that labels oftentimes change with different time periods, and whatever the culture or the dominant power is, controlling the narrative at hand is the one that produces whatever the map might be. Okay. Okay, I'll let Lee ask the next question.
Thanks, Parthi. So many great things I want to speak to, but I'm going to just get right to the question. I'm mindful of time, and it sort of segs on the other comments and questions from other folks. So I remember on one of our KPU Wild Spaces events, you were talking
Yes.
about mapping and map making and how it can be used to dominate and control.
Yeah.
Right. So I'm curious to know about, okay, how can we decolonize maps or map making? What does that process look like? And apologies if you spoke to that earlier in your presentation. I missed some of it because I had to step out for my kid.
Okay. This is where the whole idea of how we map itself comes about. So, for example, when we map, the traditional norm is to come up with very clear boundaries. Right. So we say that this land belongs to one person, this land belongs to another person. But then when we look at, let's say, indigenous studies of First Nations, their territories do not have distinct boundaries. They always overlap. Right. So one of the challenges that we have is how do we display that on a map? Making sure that the information is useful to whoever is reading the map. So these are some of the challenges that we currently face in terms of map making. I do know that there is a First Nations or Aboriginal mapping agency here in British Columbia that is actively looking at how they map the different First Nations group within this province called British Columbia. How successfully we can portray that is always a challenge, because obviously, someone else will come and say, no, this is not exactly where the boundary is. This is where some other boundary is, right? And this is why I introduced the notion of mental maps. So if we can bring all of those mental maps together and then look at how the actual landscape is, then perhaps we can come to some kind of compromise in terms of how we can map, Indigenous or First Nations map. But we have to recognize that the map will be constantly changing, because events change dynamically, both in terms of space and time. I hope that answers your question.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Parthi, and everyone who asked questions. It's 2:01, so our time is over. I wanted to thank you, Parthi, again, and invite everyone to attend the next Our Speaker Series session on electrical vehicles, which will be on March 5th from 1 p.m. to 2 p.m. Thanks, everyone, and see you next time.
Thank you.